Hi, everybody. Um, Thank you and welcome here. I'm really glad to see you. Um, my name is Sasha Rosenbaum. I'll introduce myself in a second some more. I would typically walk around while presenting, but for multiple good reasons, with your permission, I'm going to stay seated today. If that's okay. I think this is a small enough room that everyone can see me and we're good. Um, so to introduce myself a little bit, I've been in IT various roles for probably 20 years. Can't believe I'm that old either. I started as a developer, spent a few years in development. I did some, used to be called system administration, so did some Opsy stuff in a couple places. And so when the kind of, I hope this is the only slide with automated timing. We're going to be very entertained here. So basically, did a whole bunch of roles across the industry. Got deeply into DevOps when DevOps first came out. So when the whole DevOps Days conferences started, I was helping run DevOps Days Chicago. So that's been running now. This is the 9th year. So we've been talking about DevOps for a really long time. And I've seen kind of the industry have different definitions of DevOps over time and sort of repeatedly struggle with the same problems over and over again. Like we discover solutions, we implement solutions, and then we go to a different place, to a different company, a different country, and then suddenly like we forget all the lessons we learned and start over. And then I worked in product, I worked in DevRel, I worked in technical sales, I worked in consulting, so just literally every technical job that I could think of. And then recently, we've started a consulting startup. So we now do sort of, I would say our goal in life is to rescue your DevOps transformations that didn't go so well. By the way, has anyone here had a DevOps transformation that didn't go really well for their company or themselves? A couple people. I think this is pretty common. It's either the transformation itself actually fails or like it is declared as a failure for one reason or another. And so kind of I think we all got a little bit tired of working for companies that tell you that like all you need to do is buy this new piece of software and then like all of your problems will be magically solved. So like just move to this CI/CD tool or this Kubernetes cluster or whatever it is, and like suddenly magically everything is going to be great. Just for my information, like who considers themselves a developer in this room? Okay, operations or DevOps, SRE, whatever we call it today. Cool. Anybody else? Security? No. Okay. Management? Cool. Anyone I forgot to mention? Value stream mapping people? All right, so I'll start. I like to start with the history. It depends on how far into the history I go. But like once upon a time, we've developed sort of separate skills. So like it all started with like people working with computers, right? Like computer science is not that old, like programming is not that old. So it's all started with us making things. But gradually we developed kind of two different roles that are like major drivers for the industry is like developers and operations, right? And they didn't like progressively talked less and less to each other. And so that created like this wall of confusion between them, and lots of companies started communicating through ticketing systems. So like devs would open tickets for the operations would throw tickets back at the dev, and so like there was no communication. And also we used to think that developers are all about speed and innovation and like making new features and doing great things, and ops are all the reliability, so their job is just to say no to everything and block our progress, right? So separate incentives and separate drivers, and it was really hard to get people aligned. So around 2009, like actually a little bit before that, some conversations started. So this year is my co-founder, Andrew Clay Schaefer, who was giving a keynote today. So he was involved in some of these conversations. And like one major thing that happened was a little conference called DevOps Days in Ghent, Belgium. So not too far from here. And I think there was like 150 people at the conference, and there was all the people who were interested in the topic of DevOps at that point. And then I think another key development in the whole industry was Jez Umbel and Dave Farley published a book called Continuous Delivery, which talked about a lot of the same ideas we talk about today, right? So these were kind of the two drivers of the change starting to happen. And then I specifically call out Bridget Crowell because I think she was like very instrumental to this, to the DevOps Days organization become huge. But like DevOps Days grew from a single conference to like before the pandemic, it was like 70-ish events around the globe. So this is like a major driver of DevOps popularity. And also, like you can see, like corresponding Google searches. So, like in 2009, no one knows what DevOps is. The word didn't even exist. And then, like over time, it progressively gets more and more popular. If you do a comparative search with tacos, we still lose by like orders of magnitude. So, we're locally popular. And then one more thing that I think is instrumental to the whole thing is State of DevOps report came out of Puppet originally, was driven by Nicole Forsgren and a couple more people, and it popularized 4 key metrics, one of which was, how fast can you deploy your code, and like so some are around like how fast you go, and some are how much things break, and so basically disputed the idea that the faster you go, the more things break, right? It's actually proven that for most organizations, if you go faster, you actually make less failure and recover faster from changes. So these were all good things. Basically, we kind of discovered this new idea that actually, like, deployment are like training the muscle, right? If you deploy once a year, you're going to be weak. If you deploy every day, you train that muscle, you get better at it. You kind of discover and eliminate that pain. These are all good things. I think one of the analogies I like for how fast you're going is like software development is like riding a bicycle. So like if you go too slow on a bicycle, you're going to fall over, right? You can't maintain your balance if you go in too slow. But I also like the bicycle analogy because you want to be in control. So the main idea is not like you driving for as fast as you can go. It's also like you going fast enough to have the balance, but also being in control of that movement. So while we're all kind of discovering this journey and talking about things at the conferences and sharing ideas about best practices and all of these things, kind of grassroots movement, because DevOps Days was a fully volunteer-driven conference, right? So it wasn't like some type of executive mandate. At some point, CIOs, COOs, CTOs got ideas about like DevOps being the new hot thing. And so DevOps transformation started getting funded in companies. So, like if you look at the CEO speak, CIO speak vocabulary, like all of these things, like everybody's doing a transformation of some kind. So it's digital, cloud, platform, DevOps. Now it's all AI, like right, it's all blowing up. We constantly going after new buzzwords that we're chasing. I think a lot of times what happens is it's all about funding, right? So like people got funding for Agile transformation 20 years ago. Then they couldn't talk about Agile anymore, right? So they got funding for like DevOps transformation. Then now they got funding for platform engineering transformation or microservices transformation. So it's like you have to create a new thing to go after to be able to get funding for like a lot of times just trying to get rid of technical debt and institute better practices. But what comes out of this continuous sort of chase of buzzwords is a couple things. So one of the things that happens is like we just rename things. So I know a lot of companies that had like sysadmin team or a customer support team that got renamed to operations team, got then renamed to DevOps team, then got renamed to now SRE, and now maybe platform engineering, or alternatively, you have like both SRE and DevOps and platform engineering teams that are all like sort of doing something and are not like correlated and working together. So we just kind of keep giving new names to things and not changing practices. That's like happens a lot of times in the industry. And then the second thing that I think is a bit of a problem is we just told people to move faster, right? So like the DORA report was very instrumental in proving that moving faster is not necessarily opposite to quality. But the problem is that everybody decided that moving faster is the main goal. Like that's the only thing we want, right? And so a lot of people we talk to, they're kind of like, okay, we're not deploying fast enough. And then we start talking about their practices, and like they're just not mature. Like they have the tools, they have the pipelines, but everything around it, like the socio-technical system, is not working. And so like they think their only metric is how fast they can deploy code to production, but it's really not like what they need. So, you know, we can rebuild them. We have the technology. We basically what happened is people said DevOps is about tools, and so we created all of these tools for CI/CD, which now you can build everything. You can automate everything from like your infrastructure deployment to your platform deployment to your software deployment. You can build this all automatically. You can have a repeatable process. Can have it all checked in source control. Technically, you can do it all in minutes, and like, you know, depending on the size of your deployment, maybe an hour or two. But basically, all these tools are like a lot of power without like process, right? So what happens a lot is like people build these massive automation tools, but they are not in control what happens. So like, to me, like you can't have continuous integration, continuous delivery if you're not testing. And a lot of people are not having any quality controls, right, in the pipelines. So like they will just push stuff to production, and the quality control is minimal or non-existent, or there's no automated testing, or there's minimal automated testing. There's no security gates. There's nothing like that to review the process. So like we're just going to prod. Or alternatively, like there's these pipelines, but they're not actually merged to production. And so like we say we do CI/CD, but we don't really, and we just wait for like actually 3 months for someone to approve the actual change. And so like if you're doing this, like a lot of times, like you have all the automation, but you're still delivering something that's not good value to your production systems. So did we get DevOps wrong in the whole thing? Like was it the mistake in the original idea of DevOps? I think not. So I think like we talked a lot, who's familiar with this acronym? CALMS, Culture, Automation, Lean Measurement, and Sharing? A couple people? Okay. So when we, like, again, this goes back 10-ish years ago, right? We used to say that, like, DevOps is not just about one thing. Like, right, you can't say it's about one thing. It's about all of these things, and they have to kind of play into it for you to be able to do the transformation. Kind of what Andrew talked about is like, this is depending on your context, and this is depending on the system working together. You can't just remove everything, like remove your constraints and be like, oh, we just do one thing. But what I see a lot in the industry is people focus on two of the things, like, right? Either culture or automation, usually also to the exclusion of one or the other, right? So some people really focus on driving culture, and some people really focus on driving automation. Automation definitely won, because I think a lot of our sort of definition of words comes from people marketing things to us. So like everybody wants to sell you a product, right? So like automation is given rise to a lot of products. So we talk about DevOps tools more than we talk about anything else. So in terms of culture, the interesting thing is when you come in and you try to change the culture, our naive assumption is always that we just have to convince people that something is a good idea. So like I come in and I talk to a lot of people and I explain to them why something's good. I bring them a scientific paper that says that it's good, and then I'm going to win them over, and then they're going to change the behavior. But like in reality, this is not how changing culture works. And so like usually when you do these kind of massive conversation builders, they wane over time. So there's one idea that I like that comes from BJ Fogg. This is a guy who is taught classes at Stanford that led to like development of Instagram and all of the addictive social media of the day. So you have him to thank for all your social media addictions. But anyway, he talks about motivation matching. So like you can't make people do what they don't want to do. Like you can't really come in and convince someone to do something they don't care about. So you help people do what they already want to do. So you take their existing motivation, you discover what it is, and then you align the thing that you want with the thing that they want already, right? So that's one idea that like kind of is leveraged a lot in like how we're tricked into addictive social media and games and stuff like that, like because his stuff is actually leveraged a lot in there. But the other thing is that's actually organizational research from Egershane that basically discovered that the culture change works in the opposite direction. So you don't start with convincing, you start with change in behavior. So this is a quote from a paper on Edgar Shane's research. So anyone wanting to change culture needs to define the actions and behaviors they desire, then design the work processes that are necessary to reinforce these behaviors, right? So you design the process, which is like, you can start with tools. Tools are good. You bring in the tools that enable that stuff, right? Then you bring in the incentives that like reinforce that behavior. And then people actually learn that they get better outcomes by different behavior, right? So in terms of automation, I used to say automate all the things. It used to be my Twitter bio. I don't have a screenshot of the Twitter bio. I have a screenshot of someone quoting it, but automate all things used to be a thing that I used to say. I think I kind of matured to say there's caveats to this. So there's this research paper called Ironies of Automation that lists a number of ironies about automation, but so one I like to point out is automation drift. So this is a mandatory XKCD. So in theoretical realm, you start with a task that is manual, you write code to automate it, and then everything else is free time, right? It freed you up to not do this again. But in reality, what happens is, well, here he goes also to it takes time to develop the automation, but more importantly, any automation is code, right? So it has to be maintained and continuously developed. And automation drift starts immediately. So anything you automate in your system needs to be like source controlled and versioned and needs to keep up with the other changes in your system. So like if you have the budget to implement the original automation but not to maintain it, you're in trouble. And that happens a lot. The other thing is like kind of thinking about the magnitude of the thing. So like this is Rain, who I think at that point worked at Netflix, but he says, yes, I mean automation eliminates human errors in the sense that those errors will now be performed by machines. And then automation, how to make mistakes consistently, repeatably, and really fast. So kind of what I like to say is like, we used to not be able to take an entire data center out by one line of code, but now we can because it's all being automated. The other problem with automation is that it can calcify a bad process. So if you have an organizational process that requires multiple steps, multiple approvals, and like just generally not an efficient thing, and you write automation that just replicates it, you're gonna get bad results in automation. And sometimes automation is harder to change than a process that existed before. And like, this is my favorite one, but like, all systems are socio-technical, which means that so we have this naive idea that if you take the human out of the system will be perfect. So Andrew talked about it a lot in terms of like the coal mines example and the GM example. It's like, we think that if we put machines into somewhere and like take humans out of it, things are going to work better, faster. But this is not what happens because like in the end, entropy always wins, right? You need humans. Human life is the only thing bringing order to the system. Like if you built something and you left it running and you left, it would disintegrate over time because all systems strive towards more chaos, right? Unless there's humans involved that are maintaining the system. So that's like, this is an idea that like keeps repeating itself. In fact, like GM was like well-researched example, but actually Tesla did this a couple years ago. They were like, we're going to automate everything and throw all the humans out. And that went terribly wrong in exactly the same way GM did in the 80s. And kind of we don't learn. We just keep repeating the same thing. So let's talk about, like, I talked a lot about things that sort of don't work or kind of lead to problems, right? Let's talk about the forgotten pillar. I think probably the most important one that, like, we don't invest in enough. So that's measurement or metrics in comms. And like, so my hypothesis is if you had good metrics, then, and you had good incentives for your people, then you could fix anything, right? Because you can continuously drive towards improvement. And the problem with most organizations is they just don't know how they're doing in the first place, so they can't improve. So the aim of the system must be clear to everyone in the system. Without an aim, there is no system. The aim is a value judgment. This is coming from Deming. So not only do we want to know what our value proposition is, right? We also want everyone in that system to be aware of this. So like your humans are not mechanically performing tasks. Your humans are actually driving towards value. And this doesn't matter where in the system they sit. So we want to measure value. And the problem with that is that measuring value is difficult, right? So like that's the actual core of a problem. If measuring delivery of value was easy, then we would do it all day. But unfortunately, proxies for value are not that easy to come by, right? So we default to measuring things instead. So in terms of like organizations that exist out there, like there's first type of organization that just doesn't measure anything that happens. It's not that common, but it's more common than you would think. It's like organizations that just don't have any metrics on stuff. But then there's like the other type of organization that is like, they measure things, just nobody knows how these things relate to actual like achieving goals, right? So in terms of like, for instance, work process, they will measure velocity, but like, is velocity delivering something to the customer? I don't know. We're doing points on user stories, right? And then like in terms of, for instance, like the health of your systems, like my favorite one is like CPU percentage. Okay, are my users happy? I don't know. Like my CPU percentage is 70%, must be fine. So metrics issues, like the top 3 issues are, they're subjective, right? Any metric is subjective. Metrics tend to get imbalanced. So if you're driving towards just one thing, you're probably not going to get where you want. And then metrics are a proxy for values. So you need to kind of be on top of like, is this metric still a good representation of value? So I'm going to pick on my absolutely favorite horrible metric that I think is like this very popular and agile, right? So velocity, right? So let's give an example of velocity, why it's not a good metric. So it's subjective. So if like in most agile transformations, there will be a coach that comes in and goes, let's measure your velocity. Okay, let's now like measure stories and like break stories into smaller stories so we have more story points. Okay, our velocity increased. Like this like happens every single time. It's like, did you actually deliver more work, more software, more value, or did you just have a story point inflation? So like this is highly subjective. The imbalance is like, did we sacrifice quality while trying to drive for velocity, right? So did we go faster at the expense of doing better? And then proxy, again, the hardest one. Did we deliver more units of value? And most people can't tell you that because most people don't have any user analytics to even back this up and like tell you how you're doing against your customers. So in terms of subjectivity, what gets measured gets gamed, right? This like Goodhart's law. So when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So for example, if you measure people on the number of nails they made, right, then you might get 1,000 tiny nails that don't actually help you nail anything to the wall. If you measure people on weight of nails made, you may get a few giant heavy nails, right? In this case, it's easy to see that neither of those things is what we want. But the way to avoid this is to actually balance these metrics with each other. So you don't have a single metric, you have a number of metrics that help you achieve the result that you're actually driving for. There's a lot of these examples studied in education where like the test becomes the goal. So instead of being a proxy for value, the educational test becomes the goal, and it drives to all sorts of bad outcomes. So to do better than that, you want a balanced system of metrics, right? So there's this quote from Eliyahu Goldratt, who wrote the goal and like started the theory of constraints stuff. So tell me how you measure me, and I will tell you how I behave. If you measure me in an illogical way, do not complain about an illogical behavior. So this is an example of system of metrics that comes from Jay Bloom, another one of my co-founders, in collaboration with Troy McGinnis. But this is an example in terms of work process, right? We can talk about 3 different types of metrics, but like in terms of work process, you don't just want to measure throughput, right? You don't just want to measure how much you're delivering. You want to balance quality, predictability, responsiveness, and leverage. Leverage in this case is code reuse, so like how much of stuff you're able to leverage that you have already implemented. So it's like easy to see, for instance, if we talk about like Agile and Scrum, a lot of times we overvalue either responsiveness or predictability. Predictability tends to be the culprit here because people are like, oh no, you cannot change what stories went into my Scrum. Like I have to deliver exactly the stories that went into my Scrum, otherwise we're not predictable. Like, okay, but if your customer wants something and they want it now, what's the value of like you being predictable as opposed to you delivering what the customer wants? But at the same time, you also don't want to be like overweight on like just responsiveness. So again, what you want when you're designing your metrics inside of your system is to measure balanced metrics across multiple layers. And like, for instance, for work output, you probably want at least 1 or 2 metrics for each one of these, right, buckets, so you can drive towards good outcomes. Now, I'm gonna like go to like, if you haven't read this book, this is the first one that came out of Google, Site Reliability Engineering. It's a really good book. And if you haven't read it and you're in any DevOps-oriented space, I highly recommend checking it out. It talks a lot about how to implement site reliability engineering, and I think one of the major things about site reliability engineering, as opposed to just talking about DevOps, is it was more prescriptive about the process and specifically about the metrics. So one of the things they talk about, this is just an example, but like it all started with latency. So they basically discovered that if your website doesn't load in like, say, 2 seconds, I don't remember what the exact number was for back then when they started measuring it. So if your website didn't load in under 2 seconds, users just abandoned it, right? So that was one of their first metrics for reliability. And reliability was a feature of the product, like, right? So this is not some, I have network errors, I have this, I have that, like I have incidents, I have downtime. This is like, if I don't deliver the website within 2 seconds, my user's just going to abandon me, which means I don't make money, which means I don't deliver value, so this is kind of what you want out of your metrics, is to be proxy for value. Now, latency is just one of them, like, right? I can deliver the page very fast, but it's not doing what you want it to do. That's not a problem. But you kind of have to have metrics that are good proxy for value. So again, the true goal is to deliver value, and you want to basically figure out what your value is. So who's familiar with the concept of SLAs, SLIs, SLOs, error budgets? Okay, a bunch of people, good. So if you haven't had a chance and you're interested in this topic, so a good resource is SLO DLC. It's a open source driven community that talks about how to develop SLOs and kind of walks you through the entire process. There's examples, there's a workbook. It's a very good place to get started. So like everyone's familiar with SLA. It's your financially backed availability, usually measured in uptime. That is usually measured in kind of the number of nines that you're delivering. And so like this is where we all start with, just like, kind of like, okay, we want this number of nines, and this means this much of downtime, and then people get refunded if we're below that downtime, right? So like, I think everyone's familiar with how this works. So SLAs are about aligning incentives between vendors and customers, right? So like if someone's providing me software as a service and they don't have an SLA, I'm probably not buying it, right? That's a minimal promise that I want. So SLAs are usually a single metric, and they're like usually under promise and over deliver, right? Because I never want to actually refund my customers. So anyone wants to venture to define an SLO for me? Service level objective as opposed to service level agreement. Volunteers. Sure, it can be that. So an agreement between the departments on the service you provide to another department, it can be that for sure. But it's also around your service to your customers, right? So SLO is an objective. It just means your target. So if my SLA is 4 nines, my target's usually higher than that, like, right? I never want to hit my SLA, so I want my objective to be better, right? Whether it's less downtime, less errors, whatever it is, we're defining it around. But again, we always start with availability. Availability is actually not enough. So if you look at availability, availability is just, am I up, right? Like, am I 200 okay? Like, okay, this is good, this is a good start, but it is not enough to describe if your users are getting what they want. So like the other thing that usually happens here is like people start with 5 nines. 5 nines translates to 5.26 minutes a year. Most people can't afford that. Like having that as your like max downtime, that like if you properly define downtime, this means like all your maintenance windows, all your updates, anything that you have that ever goes wrong in your software, like has to be in 5.26 minutes a year. Like that's if your C-level person or a business person says they need 5 nines, tell them that. Like, can you actually pay for this? But the other thing is like, will your users even notice that this is happening? And the answer is if you're on the internet, they won't, because your internet service provider error rate is up to 1%. So if you are delivering 5 nines, the internet might not be good enough to even like for people to even know that. They will still have some hiccups on the network. And then like, of course, if you don't deliver value, it doesn't matter how good like your uptime is, right? So this is why reliability is a better term. So reliability is actually doing what your users expect the service to do. So like if I have a business that you go shopping, like, right, if it's e-commerce, if I can't check out of my cart, I don't have reliability. Like my page can load, it can be 200, okay, whatever. If I can't click the button to purchase the product, reliability is nil, right? So you have to define your reliability as a proxy. So a SLO, service level objective, is targeted reliability. So you want it to be a proxy of value. And then the other thing that I want to talk about is like in terms of rescuing DevOps transformation, right? SLO is business approved reliability. This is important. So like we talked about the business person wanting 5 nines. If your business person thinks that you should be available 100% of the time and you're like, oh no, we define an SLO as 3.5 nines and you know we said it was okay, they're like, no. Like a customer called me and you were down for 5 minutes and that's not acceptable, right? So this is a discussion you have to have up front. Like what is the target availability you have? And you have to have that buy-in from multiple stakeholders, so not just from Dev and Ops, but also from your business in terms of what is the target that you're trying to achieve. And again, this is sort of better than just talking about DevOps and talking about how we're all going to work together and align and whatever. This is actual numbers. When you can present numbers to people and you can actually present them with like, we're doing better this month than we did last month and stuff like that. So SLOs are about explicitly aligning incentives between business and engineering. And then who's familiar with the concept of error budgets? Way less people, okay, that's interesting. So error budgets are, in my opinion, key to implementing any kind of site reliability practice, right? So like error budgets are acceptable level of unreliability. And this, again, this is touch point to talk to your business about how you're gonna do this. So error budget is 1 minus an SLO, or 100% 1 minus an SLO, right? So if your SLO is 4 nines, then you have 1% of error budget, which is, I'm switching timeframes here, but like that's sometimes useful. 13 minutes a quarter of downtime. right? So I have ideally somewhere I have a dashboard that says a metric how much error budget I have left, right? And when I burn down that metric, when it gets into the red, I'm like, I'm going to breach my SLO, which means I might breach my SLA, which means we're going to be in trouble, right? So this is something I should be looking at all the time, right? And then the next question to ask is like, what happens when you blow the error budget? And if nothing happens, then you're in trouble too, like, right? Because you have to be able to use this metric to actually take action. So we all know that trying to stop developers from pushing more features can feel like trying to stop a moving train. So error budgets are about aligning incentives between dev and product and ops. So like if your product wants to drive for more features, you have to be able to say, no, we're close to blowing our error budget, which means we're going to start breaching SLOs and SLAs, and that's a problem, like, right? So when the error budget is drained, developers' projects should shift focus from delivering new features to improving reliability. That's the ideal. This is, again, if you read the book, this is how they do it, like, right? They actually stop development of new features and focus developers on reliability. Because, as we said, reliability is a feature of a product. So what helps here, and again, I think this is a lot about incentives, but like what helps here is measuring developers and product on the same SLOs. So like if we blow the SLO, it's not just an ops problem, it's also a dev problem, right? So like if the product bonuses get dinged because SLO is breached, then maybe you will see some change. So again, we're talking about numbers and not just kind of cultural attempts to change. So like I said, reliability is a feature of a product. So in the sense of tapping into existing motivation, sometimes when you talk to product or developers and you say, oh, like our latency is too high. They're like, I don't care about your latency. It sounds like a network problem. You should go optimize your stuff, right? When you talk about like, okay, but that latency is leading users to abandon the website. It's leading people to have a bad customer experience, Mr. Product or Mrs. Product. Like, we should care about the customer experience. Usually, this is a way better conversation. So find a way to tap into a motivation that developers and product already have. And then one important thing here is the SLI. So SLI is service level indicator, and that's your actual reliability. So a lot of times when you start these conversations, people actually don't know how reliable they are. A lot of people don't even don't know how available they are, but most people don't know how reliable they are, right? So lots of dashboard, lots of data, not a lot of information. So what we usually recommend people do is start with SLIs. So they actually start measuring how they're doing. And so like you actually figure out how to implement the SLI, like how to measure the SLI, how to get data from your systems and then define it in a way that the metric makes sense. And then you go and measure the SLIs for a month or two, right? To figure out how you're doing. So then you can actually come to your executives or your business people and say, we're at 3 nines right now. We want to get to 4, but like it will take us 6 months to get better, right? So you're not just talking about vague concepts like we're going to be 100% available, but like you actually know how you're doing against the measurement. And then an important thing is like in terms of metrics. So there's a way to define metrics that is actually helpful. So one thing to start with is an operational definition. So one thing that happens a lot too is that people actually define, say, the same velocity as my favorite metric to pick on, differently in different parts of the organization. So some will be talking about one thing, some will be talking about another thing. An operational definition is a procedure that's agreed upon for translation of a concept into measurement of some kind. So you have to be very, very strict about like number of errors means the same thing between different teams, right? And then there's this concept that's called, so I think this is very helpful when you start defining metrics, right? This is called Autumn. You can find it on the internet. This is a blog by Larry Macron. Basically, when you start defining metrics, you start with an objective. Then you ask, so you go, okay, my objective, what decisions do I need to make when, to meet this objective, right? Given the need for these decisions, what insights do I need to improve it? And then given that insight, what do I need to measure? So what do you need to measure should lead to an objective. It's not, again, you don't just measure CPU uptime and then you say, okay, well, my CPU uptime is this much and this is the trending line. And it's like, okay, what information does it give me? So in some cases, it might actually give me information. It might mean that if it spikes, I need to scale out, right? It might not mean anything. So I want to start like with the objective, like, right, that I want to achieve and go work all the way down from there. And again, the same objective can result in multiple metrics. And then this is another thing that is my favorite, probably my favorite trick about defining metrics is when you define the metric, think about who looks at it and how often they look at it and what decisions they're gonna make based on looking at it. So a lot of people have dashboards that no one looks at, and you ask them, okay, how are you measuring something? How are you measuring the outcome? How are you measuring this? And they're like, oh, well, we have a dashboard somewhere, I can pull it up. And then you like look at it and it's a lot of pretty charts. And it's like, what information does it give you? Who looks at it? It's like, I don't know, someone built it at some point and then no one actually looks at it. So start with the meeting you're gonna have. Like, right, talk about like, okay, the cadence of the meeting is once a month. Once a month, we're gonna look at this dashboard. It's gonna have these numbers, and it's gonna be like in the green if it's this way, in a red if it's this way. We're gonna make these decisions based on these numbers, right? That automatically makes your metrics much more valuable. And then I like this one. If knowledge was all it took, we'd all have six-pack abs. Theoretical knowledge is like the first step to learning, but it like actually requires implementation. So to summarize what I think is to rescue your DevOps, you want to measure delivering value to customers. So again, it's all about all of it. Developers, operations, security, all of them kind of need to agree on the fact that they're delivering value to customer, right? And then you want to align the team incentives to delivering value, right? So it's all about like basically what people get paid on, right? Like if you align incentives wrong, you're gonna get wrong outcomes. So work on gradual improvements, and this is just my favorite quote I like to put everywhere. The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. We already know all the lessons. We don't need new lessons, we don't need new awards. We just need to implement things that we know work and we have research that they work. Okay, so this is it for my slides, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you.